people who join us in the webinar number 177 since the Andean Health Organization, Hipólito Unano Agreement, started the cycle of webinars in May 2020. 3 years of continuous interlearning. In the projection of the Andean Health Organization, there are concepts loaded with content that mark our daily work and that act consistently with the ideas we defend. The first is health and well-being. We cannot conceive of health except in its relationship with all the areas that make up life in society and in nature. Second, social and environmental justice. Earth is the home of all beings, and it is only in harmony. Therefore, it is the One Health approach defined as the collaborative efforts of multiple disciplines working at local, national, and global levels to achieve optimal health for people, animals, and the environment. And this is essential to us. Reflections on these and other priorities relevant to health and well-being can be found in the monthly Noti Salud Andinas newsletter, available on the Andean Health Organization's website. We invite you to leave your name, organization, and country in the comment box of the Facebook Live or YouTube Live chat. In the same space, you can leave your questions or send them via email to webinarshorasconu@gmail.com. In this webinar, we will follow the usual dynamics. We will start with institutional greeting, followed by the presentations of our speakers, and then we will move to the Q&A session. To access the certificate of attendance, as usual, in any of the chats of Facebook Live or YouTube Live, you will find a fixed link where you must fill out a brief survey and leave your data as email. Please verify that your email is correctly written for sending the certificate, which will be sent in the coming days to your mailboxes. To begin this important day, I give the floor to Dr. María del Carmen Calle, Executive Secretary of the Andean Health Organization, who will give the welcome institutional greeting. Go ahead, dear Dr. Calle. Thank you very much, Bertita. Well, the Andean Health Organization Hipólito Unano Agreement was established by decision of the Ministers of Health of Bolivia, Chile, Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, and Venezuela in December of 1971. On December 18, 2022, we celebrate 51 years of uninterrupted work with the vision of making significant progress in the effective exercise of the right to health of the population. Since May 2020, we have been holding weekly webinars. We have received many testimonies of the significant contribution of webinars in the lives of thousands of people in these 3 years of promoting interlearning on a continuous basis. As an example of this, today, Thursday, June 8, we will hold webinar number 177, which aims to present the main ideas of the 6th report of the Intergovernmental Group of Experts on Climate Change. Human activities, and mainly greenhouse gas emissions, have caused the climate crisis, and it is necessary to take action. This is the conclusion once again reached by the Intergovernmental Group of Experts on Climate Change. In its synthesis of the 6th report, a summary that brings together 3 reports, 743 scientists who review thousands of publications to draw conclusions on the climate emergency and how to address it. This report is very important for the world because it provides the most up-to-date scientific evidence available on climate change. The report warns of the need of urgent action to combat climate emergency. More ambitious actions are urgently needed. If we act now, it is still possible to ensure a sustainable and livable future for all people. We are holding this webinar to commemorate the World Environment Day, June 5th, and the World Oceans Day, which we are celebrating today. We must work together to create a new balance in which we do not deplete what nature offers us, but restore its vitality and give it new life. For this reason, the Horas CONU, we have renewed our commitment to adopt and protect the Amazon forest. Amazonian trees contribute to the atmosphere the equivalent of 20 million tons of water per day. This moisture emitted by the trees is called flying rivers of vapor. The Chihuahuaco trees, which we have adopted, function as great water pumps, helping the formation of rivers and glaciers, which are then sources of water and life. To prioritize nature is to prioritize our health and well-being. Welcome, Matilde Rusticucci, Raquel de Andrade Cardoso. Welcome, Gabriel Blanco. Welcome to all the people who are with us. Thank you very much. After the greeting of our Executive Secretary, I introduce myself. My name is Bertaluz Pineda, sociologist, coordinator of climate change and inequalities in the Andean Health Organization. And today, I will be in charge of moderating this webinar with great pleasure. Today, we will present an important report by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate of Experts on Climate Change. This intergovernmental organization of the United States Nations, whose mission is to provide the world with an objective and scientific opinion on climate change, its natural, political, and economic impacts and risks, and possible response options. This panel was founded in 1998 by two UN organizations, the World Meteorological Organization and the United Nations Environment Program, and subsequently endorsed by the UN General Assembly. The IPCC produces reports that contribute to the work of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the main international treaty on climate change, and of course, to the work of governments, organizations, and civil society. Thousands of scientists and other experts contribute on a voluntary basis by writing and reviewing reports, which in turn are reviewed by representatives of all governments. The IPCC also publishes a summary for policymakers, subject to line-by-line approval by all participating governments. It usually involves the joint work of more than 120 countries. In 2015, the IPCC initiated the preparation of the sixth assessment report, and some of the key aspects are presented today with a lot of joy and recognizing the important challenges that we have. We will present them today. After this preamble, we extend a warm welcome to Engineer Gabriel Blanco, Gabriel is a full professor at the Faculty of Engineering of the Universidad Nacional Centro de la Provincia de Buenos Aires. He graduated as an engineer from the University of Buenos Aires and has a postgraduate training at the University of Massachusetts in the field of energy resources and renewable energy. In recent years, he was coordinator of the Technological Needs Study of the Ministry of Science, Technology, and Innovation in the United Nations Environment Program, and coordinator of the study of mitigation and inventory of greenhouse gases in the waste sector, or Argentina's National Commission on Climate Change. Currently is a professor of postgraduate programs in several universities in the country and abroad. The author of the report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, author of the GEO6 report of the UN Environment Program, member and former president of the Executive Committee on Technologies of the United Nations Convention on Climate Change, and is part of the international negotiation team on climate change on the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Go ahead, dear Gabriel, you have the space and the floor. Hello, thank you. Thank you, Berta. Welcome to all of you. It's a pleasure to be with you. I'd like to share some images while I give my lecture. So I'm going to start sharing that presentation. Let me see if I can do it. Let me see if you can see it. Yes, go ahead. Well, the idea of this presentation is to comment the outcomes or results of the work performed in the IPCC, in particular in the working group 3, that deals with the problem of the emissions that cause the climate change, and also considers options or alternatives to reverse that situation with pros and benefits and problems that this could generate in the economic, social, etc. context. So I'm going to show you some of the probably most relevant results. First of all is how we got here. We know the GHG emission trends since several decades ago. This is from 1990 to current, but this is a trend that has more than a century going on, and the emissions still grow, dominated by those emissions of CO2 that come from fossil fuel and industry, which represent 2/3 of total emissions, to which we add other emissions of the energy-related industry and other emissions, of course, of the use of the soil, and includes farming, agriculture, livestock, and other uses of the soil, such as deforestation process. So that's a current landscape, nothing new, but it's worth remembering how did we get here? Now, when you look at those emissions from the other side, in terms of consumption, what are the activities that consume or generate those emissions? There we can see, of course, that energy industry systems, the power generation, the industry has a good portion of those emissions. Sector of agriculture, livestock, and the use of soil, and transportation, of course, as one of the sectors that generates more emissions. The emissions can be seen and analyzed in different ways. Of course, that the planet is only interested in how many emissions are concentrated in the atmosphere and are going to be absorbed by the oceans and are incorporated into the biosphere. That's what the planet is interested in. But other perspectives of those emissions are also important to consider when discussing or negotiating among countries how to approach this, see, or what are the greater responsibilities. So those other perspectives include, for example, as is shown on the left, what are the regions that has largest emission or how much is emitted by each region in our planet, where we can see the Asian and developing Pacific dominated by China and India, but especially China that's dominating today this thing with 44% of emissions, followed by by developed countries, where we see Latin America and the Caribbean and so on. The figure in the middle shows the variations of those emissions in the last decade. And there we can see that all the regions have increased their emissions, except developed countries that were able to do a slight decrease of the level of emissions in this last decade. And to the right, historical CO2 emissions, where you consider them since 1850 to current time, and to determine the responsibility, and we can see the North America as the main historical emitter, followed by Europe, Asia, and Latin America and the Caribbean has 11% of the historical emissions. Another way to look at this is the emissions per capita or per region or by region, when this is also important to know who is who in all this game, if we can call it a game. So there we see North America leading these per capita emissions, followed by Europe or Eastern Europe and so on. And Latin America and the Caribbean starts once again in the middle. We're not the worst or the best in this picture. Another way to look at the emissions, the idea of clarifying or contributing to the clarification of who's who and what is the role of each region in each country, is to look at the emissions based on consumption of each region. Not only so no longer we're going to consider the emissions inside each country, but looking at what is the consumption in that country. So to the emissions generated in a country, we need to add the emissions associated to the products that that country imports from other and subtract the emissions of the country exports associated to the products that that country exports. So there things change a little bit, but we see that some countries, when you consider the emissions by consumption, those emissions are smaller to the emissions that are on the territory, and in some other cases it's the opposite, just some cases of developed countries. The emissions by consumption are higher than the emissions measured or calculated on their production inside their territory. So far, the description of the landscape in those terms, the concerning is that the emissions continue to increase despite some agreements achieved in recent years. The Paris Agreement, despite that, the emissions continue to rise, and while they are growing, the windows of opportunities are closing. And what we see here, if we want to contain the increase or stop the increase of the global temperature of the global mean temperature of the planet, that could be reasonable from the point of view of the impacts that may be generated and all the associated risks. For that not to happen, we need to go over a budget, carbon budget, and not to go beyond that carbon budget, the emissions, the trajectory should be as we see in the left graph. So we are growing, increasing emissions, but we need to decrease, and to think that to the half of the century, the net emissions will be close to zero. And by that net emissions, I mean the difference between what is produced towards the atmosphere and what is being absorbed in certain areas. So that is the situation. It's quite concerning, of course, because we're far from these necessary trajectories for that temperature increase doesn't occur. And in this graph, when you look at the emissions to the left, the accumulated emissions by the emissions by fossil fuels and the emissions from the soil that you see on the left, and you accumulate them in different periods, you see that those accumulated emissions cover that carbon budget. We are getting there, and we should not go beyond that, so the temperature of the planet doesn't increase more than 1.5 with respect to the pre-industrial temperature. So we are there. The carbon budget is being exhausted, and we have very little margin here. Having said so, I need to present the most impactant results of the report show that we not only reach the carbon budget for 1.5, we're almost there, but what this graph shows that with continuing using the infrastructure allocated to the exploitation and use of hydrocarbons, fossil fuels, by just using what we already have, we will go beyond that 1.5 carbon budget, and we will go into the budget that corresponds to an increase of 2 degrees in temperature. If you add the infrastructure plan and it's being in construction, there we go directly in the 2 degrees with the budget corresponding of an increase to temperature in 2 degrees. And I say this because in Latin America and other countries in the world, that infrastructure is still growing for the exploitation and use of fossil fuels. When you look at the projections, what you see that line in red or pink, those are the projections following current policies, and in different colors below, the projections of emissions that should be followed if we are trying to contain that increase in temperature to values to 1.5 or 2. To your right, you see some milestones that we should reach. And I'm not going to go to talk, I'm not talking about numbers. The windows are being closed, but at the same time, we could open opportunities. Said opportunities are open up. We could have political will for that. And there are available options today in each sector that can reduce emissions 2030, but it will generate many other benefits that I'm going to mention right now. For example, in the energy sector, this is the current situation. If we look at the left, the primary energetic resources, how they're being transformed to go to the right, which are the sectors where they're being used, that energy. We see that today is dominated by oil, natural gas, and that should be changed into an energetic system that is based on renewable resources such as solar or aeolic or wind, reducing fossil fuels. Towards the half of the century, we hoping to transform what we need to transform. The report evaluates the mitigation potential and costs associated. We use the long bars because there's a lot of potential for reduction of emissions. If the bars are in blue, indicates that the cost of doing that is less to the cost that we'll have to continue doing the same. So today, to transition towards wind energy or solar energy up to a certain level will be more economical than continue doing what is currently being done. As you can see, there's a large number of options for mitigation according to their potential, given by the length of the bar and the cost due to explained by the color. There are bars that have yellow and red colors that indicate that the cost will be greater in this case to the current situation, but there are many bars that you can see in light blue that indicate the opposite, that the cost of implementation will be less than doing the same. In the use of floor in agriculture and livestock, there's a lot to be done. There's a lot to transform. It's quite complex because the implications of that sector, from technical issues as well as cultural issues to transform that sector, and according to the different scenarios proposed for that sector, each one of them is going to require an effort to go to unproven technologies such as the production of bioenergy with storage, carbon storage. Those are conflicting technologies that give more questions than answers, but that is the need that we have today if we want to reduce emissions in that sector for the mid portion of this century. Here I mentioned energy, the use of the soil, as well as the sectors that have more influence in the emissions, the possibilities that we can have in each one of them that are quite complex, by the way. And there's a third sector that we can call it as such, but this is a sector that's a combination of sectors. And those are the processes of urbanization. The urban areas, the large cities, and etc., have a potential to reduce emissions, and with a potential energy to improvement in other areas, improvements in quality of life, in health conditions, starting with access to services and others. So the urbanization or the processes of urbanizations, if they were planned as they should be done by taking care of these issues, they will have a potential not only to reduce emissions, but to reach some other goals related to sustainable development. There's a lot to work in that area. The projects of organizations are being generated, but we see that these processes not always take care of those issues. Now, what happens with digitization? Well, the response is that it depends, because the digitalization of economy and productive process has a lot of potential to be more efficient and to reduce consumption of raw materials and energy, but at the same time has the potential to increase the production and consumption of goods and services. We will depend on the use given to that by digitization as in other technology. We're going to be able to say if that process of digital technologies can lead us to a better world, or is more of the same, and what we do is increase that wheel of consumption and production that brought us here. The report makes an analysis of the different options of mitigations by sectors and correlates it with the sustainable development objectives. We can see how the different options may have positive synergies with many SDGs, as I mentioned, such as energy and agriculture and livestock sector, or the urbanization. Well, here we show a first preliminary analysis of possible synergies among the different mitigation options for gas emissions in sustainable development. And here I would like to say two things. That first, for many of our countries, perhaps we have to look at other SDGs before mitigation or all at the same time. And the other thing is that this effort that I'm showing you has been published in the IPCC report, but it lacks of has a problem. This work is done globally, and we know that the synergies and the impacts and the positive or negative consequences of an action have to be evaluated in each context, in each place. So I must confess that there was a lot of discussion about this table because those consequences are difficult to be evaluated globally. Not the same to do something in one place as compared to other. In some place it may be positive, in another place it will be may be negative. So each region has to evaluate what are those actions that are better integrated to their own circumstances. And I would like to emphasize. Finally, the report also considers the people as users of these services, as consumers in general, of goods, services, etc. And here it's interesting because this is the first time that the report makes emphasis on this topic. First, it makes a quantitative analysis of how much would these improvements make in terms of or reduction of emissions in different areas such as nutrition, manufacture, transportation, buildings, electric power consumptions if we change some behaviors and individual actions or social actions. Well, this is quite interesting because this is the first time that we make emphasis on this and we show, for example, that an increase in energy not necessarily or at some point it not necessarily lead to an improvement in the SDGs. This type of analysis also shown to demonstrate that not an excessive consumption of energy is going to improve your quality of life or the degree of satisfaction or happiness. For all of these, of course, we need to take some considerations. In principle, this requires a lot of financing because as we've seen, many options are cheaper or less costly than to continue doing the same. But in any case, despite being like this, we require financing to start the transformation. We require capabilities, we require technology and innovation, we require governance and public policy for the implementation. We need international cooperation. And as I recently stated, we require a new habits and behaviors, perhaps one of the most difficult here. But these are the ones that definitely come from a development model based on fossil fuels and all what it implies. And our habits and behaviors are product of that already. So it's not going to be easy to deal with them. Finally, and now I'm closing, here we see how the countries have evolved on one side in the emissions and in the other in the Human Development Index. You see that the trend that with the increase of this index of human development, there's an increase on the emissions. So the trend is upwards, but we're trying to find how we can improve our quality of life, look for equity among societies and inside societies. Without that imply a greater use of resources and more generation of greenhouse gas emissions. So with this, very quickly, a travel through this report that has very interesting things and very profound for discussion. And thank you. Thank you, Gabriel. Excellent presentation. We have many congratulations for this report. We have scientific evidence that allow us to understand the consequences of the climate crisis and the causes and the effects that it has in well-being. This report tries to address a question: who contribute more to this problem? And you were mentioning that in a scenario of a model of sustainable development with increase of gas emissions due to human activities, for example, the consumption of energy, the use of soil, agriculture, livestock, the urbanization process, among others. They all contribute to this problem. The report also offers us alternatives, and there's a lot to be done. The link also established with the SDGs are extremely important. I would like to highlight that at local level, the Andean Health Organization is working in solving this problem with a committee, for example, the Andean Committee for Risk Management and Disasters and Emergencies and Climate Change has 10 important expected outcomes for prevention and solution of this problem. This knowledge definitely urges us to design policies, plans, and to persevere in the drafting and managing of projects that will respond to the structural causes of these problems. Once again, thank you very much for your excellent conference. As I mentioned, we have received many congratulations and questions. We invite you to remain in the room because at the end, we will conduct a dialogue based on the questions generated. Thank you very much. Now we extend our warmest welcome to Dr. Matilde Monica Rusticucci. She is her degree in meteorological science and a PhD in atmospheric sciences from the University of Buenos Aires. She is currently a professor at the University of Buenos Aires and as a researcher of the National Council for Scientific and Technical Research in the Department of Atmospheric and Ocean Science in the Faculty of Exact and Natural Science at the University of Buenos Aires. She specializes in the area of climatology, particularly in the occurrence and forecasting of extreme weather events and climate change. She has a special interest in the relationship between climate and health. She is actively involved as lead author of the reports of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Go ahead, dear Dr. Matilde, you have the floor. Thank you. Once again, thank you for the invitation. Very interesting, of course, what Gabriel has presented recently to give us that overview. And I'm going to focus in the other part of the report that was on the results, on the impact, focusing on the health impacts that this report has, that has several chapters. There's one chapter in particular from our region in South America and Central America, and there's special chapters on health. So I'm going to start sharing my screen. Here you can see my screen, yes? Yes, go ahead, please. The first concept that I think that we need to clarify when we talk about impacts of climate change and risks on climate change in our activity in general is this concept that the risk is an interaction between three large dimensions. The risk of the impact in the climate dimension that we call threat or hazard, vulnerability, and exposure. In particular, when we talk about health, we know that climate with extreme events, extreme heat, droughts, flooding, storms, or the new distribution of vectors is the most important factor that where climate can increase the change of affecting health. Talk about vulnerability in the area of health. We're talking about age, gender, mobility, access to care, the socioeconomic status, pre-existing conditions, and the characteristics of the health system. When we talk about exposure, we are considering outdoor employment, housing quality, location or local geography, and the livelihood type that we're going to see later on. And then when we talk about impacts, we're talking about that the climate affects health mainly with waterborne diseases due to the poor quality, and this can also add vector-borne diseases and food-borne diseases. And if we add the migration and displacement and conflict and the system impacts in the health system itself, the response of the emergency and the food systems and livelihood systems. These three dimensions are the ones that we need to consider when we talk about risk of climate change on health in particular. We know that has direct and indirect effects through all these factors. So when we talk about climate change, we know that this global warming has caused dangerous and widespread disturbances in nature, but also is affecting the lives of billions of people despite adaptation efforts in many cases. When we focus in our region, Central and South America, they are highly exposed, highly vulnerable, and are strongly impacted by climate change. And if the situation is amplified by, in general, in our continent, have a large inequality, poverty, population growth, and high population density. The land use change, particularly deforestation, with consequent loss of diversity, such as land and land degradation, and a high dependence of national and local economies on natural resources for commodity production. So our region in the global level has some particular situations and is strongly impacted by climate change due to this fact. For example, proven, and we know that this occurs, that there's a synergy between fire, land use change, and climate change. It has a direct impact on human health because an excess of pollution, more diseases are observed in respiratory diseases due to the increase of fires, and they affect the ecosystems, food security, and livelihood of natural resource dependent communities. On average, we were able to see that people in this region were more exposed to high fire danger between 1 and 26 additional days, depending on the subregion, for the last 3 years of 2017 to 2020 if we compare to the start of the century. So in just 15 years, in some cases between 1 and 26 more days exposed to fire. This is because the climate has changed and there are more cases of heat waves, more cases of prolonged droughts. The conjunction of these two extreme events generates, in particular, the conditions for the increase of fire conditions, for example. There's also a strong impact of global warming was the loss of glaciers. The loss of glaciers in the Andes from the 1980s have been measured from 30 to more than 50% of the surface area has been lost. That glacier retreat implies for the increase of temperature and due to the precipitation variability in many regions, less precipitation that has affected the ecosystems in general and water resources, water availability for consumption or for agricultural activities of all those populations that live in areas that depend on glaciers. So as we see, the warming and climate change, global warming and climate change is defined as a sustained change in time that we be able to demonstrate that has change the weather the climate that we have now compared to that of 50 years ago or 100 years ago. And as Gabriel mentioned, we know why the reason of this, and this has generated a global warming that has generated impact in our systems. When we talk about health, the first thing that comes to our mind is the increase in the change of epidemiology of infectious diseases. For example, the effects of the increase in temperature in the increase of transmission of vector-borne diseases. We were able to measure that the reproductive potential for dengue transmission increased between 17 and 80% in the 50s to almost current time, according to sub-region, and as a result of the temperature and precipitation changes. We're having technical issues with the audio. Please stand by. Another important condition that the impacts of climate change are not equally felt by men and women. Women, particularly the poorest, are more vulnerable and are affected to a greater extent. Therefore, because they have less adaptation capacity, this further widens structural gender gaps. One of the dimensions of vulnerability that need to be considered when we look at the impact of climate change on health. So what do we know about climate? We know that the climate has changed when there was an increase of extreme events. What do we know about the future? Well, the future climate projected globally to warming, considering the greenhouse emissions with different scenarios, change of 1.5 centigrades in global warming, because when we talk about 1.5 or 2 degrees, we're talking about the average global temperature per year. So in the globe, there's an increase in 1.5. We have other values in different regions with higher increases in the north, but with increases in our region that go between 2 and 2.5 or 3.5 degrees in one region, or 1 or 1.5 degrees in others. Is potentiated with if this mean temperature reaches up to 4 centigrades in a more pessimistic forecast. But as we can see, the regional differences, but clearly the future climate shows warming, and these are mean values. But when we talk about extremes, we talk about what we feel every day. Day after day, we see different months that the temperature produces heat waves that are more sustained and more persistent in time. But when we talk about mean temperature, the future changes in temperature averages, those general warming and the extremes have a similar outlook. So there's an increase in climate average and increase in climate extreme weather. But when we talk about precipitations, the other area that conditions much of the effects and is a variable that we need to consider, when we talk about increases in the precipitation within the models give for our region, a decrease of the number of precipitations in Central South America, and a strong increase in the west of South America and the north and the southeast. That is, in average, the total amount of rain. But what happens? That rain is not going to show in the same way as this shows now. So they're going to increase in extremes. When we talk about extreme rain, this is a rain produces in a short time, concentrated in 1 or 2 days. We see that in general, all the region is going to be affected except the southwest. Larger number of rain produced in a short period of time, what we call extreme rain. So we're going to have more temperature, rain, the rain focus or concentrated in a few days, and that generates, with this concentrated rain, produces in some cases mudslides, landslides, or flooding because the soil is dry and it cannot absorb the amount of rain. And the same, when we talk about extremes, it will depend on how much that's going to change depending on the increase of the average global warming. In our region, for the maximum temperature in the year, with an increase of 1.5 degree as global average, we're talking that that temperature is going to be between 2 and 4 degrees higher if there's an increase of 1.5. But if the temperature increases 2 degrees, we talk about 5 and 6. So we're going to continue breaking records of maximum temperatures. Precipitation is going to be more intense with an increase in temperature and more intense, increase in extreme events. And this precipitation is concentrated in a few days. We have more days or continuous day without rain. So not only is going to change the amount of rain, but the way it's going to rain. And those changes generate different impacts in the environment, in the ecosystems, in the population, and in our health. So the first concept that we need to have consider when we talk about figures that seem to be small, 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees or 1.6 or 1.3, each small increase of global warming is going to result in greater risk. Every small increase in warming will result in greater impact in different sectors. For example, let's show a concrete example. In these 20 years, from 21 to 40, compared to the end of the century or the start of this century, how many days more are we having in these 20 years with temperatures over 35 centigrade? And we see that most of our region, we have between 20 and 30 days more, 1 month more. In these 20 years, we have 1 month more of temperatures over 35 compared to the past century. We have changes in total precipitation or decrease of total precipitation, but changes in extreme precipitation, a 20% change in the amount of rain that's concentrated, or a decrease in the southwest of Chile. And those comes with a strong increase of 20, 30 days more consecutive days without rain. So prolonged droughts and then a lot of concentrated rain. This is what we have now. That's the risk, climate risk that we are facing with all its consequences. We know also we need to add all the overlapping challenges in the entire region, a limit water, sanitation, and health services in many regions, that our livelihoods are very climate sensitive, high levels of poverty in some regions, weak leadership. There's a lack of funds to reverse, and so the impact is not that negative. And something that came out from the IPCC report is the lack of accountability and trust in government. And this comes from the reports of all the papers reviewed or references reviewed. When we're going to look at health, for example, the risk of death with in an event of a 2 centigrade increase, how many days more when the temperature conditions and the humidity conditions, we know that temperature and humidity work together and they increase increased risk of mortality. With an event of a 2 centigrade increase, we can see in our region, we have all these regions. We're talking about half a year more, 180 days more of risk of death with an increase of 2 centigrade. And in some regions, the entire year is going to be at risk of death with an increase of 2 centigrades global average temperature. We see that increase in temperature that we know generates death, heat waves, and increases mortality already been studied. we are having a permanent risk in some regions or half of the year, a risk of dying if the global average temperature increases by 2 degrees. Another interesting aspect to consider is what happens with the potential of mosquitoes of the Aedes aegypti transmit dengue. Many months per year in this region in gray, or this, the mosquito is present all the year. In this region, 11 months per year, 10 months here is up to 4 months per year, or 3 months, 4 months per year. At present, the mosquito has the perfect conditions to grow. This is the future, 2030, 2050, 2080, and depending on the scenario. When we talk about the scenario, we're talking of how the concentrations in the future. So the 8.5 scenario that was proposed at point as one of the most large number of emissions of gases shows that that region of 1 year moving southward. So mosquitoes have more and more possibilities to live more months. For example, we have 3 months here, and here we're going to have 4 or 5 months. And if the scenario is the 8.5, we see that it will cover more regions. And now we're talking in 2030, 2050, 2080, with half a year of the mosquito being able to transmit diseases such as dengue. So, when we talk about impact, the climate change, or what's going to see what actions we need to take to reduce the greenhouse gases emissions, with having some key risks. And if we summarize the South American region, we have 4 key risks. One is a risk to people in their health and mortality due to infrastructures are destroyed or weakened by flood and landslides. We have many cases of landslides that kill people and people disappear, or flooding with high mortality, and towns that have been affected by these slides. But there's also the infrastructure is affected, and this is due to extreme rain that occur after a period of a drought. Of course, the risk of increase of epidemics, as we mentioned, particularly of vector-borne diseases. The risk of water insecurity, because we know that there's a decrease of the snow cover, shrinking glaciers, and this precipitation variability make that the water insecurity is affected by and the water availability and the consequences that it has upon health. When we talk about coastal populations due to increase of the level of the ocean, increase of cyclonic storms and erosion generate impact on their households and impact on fish production. The means of life are affected, and therefore that generates migration, and that derives the consequences that we know that these climate migrations and forced migrations have. So in general, these are the most important outcomes that we can extract of this second group, knowing that what do we need to pay attention to strongly, and to the structures, health, direct impact, indirect impact on health, many aspects. Well, thank you very much once again for your invitation. I'm here for any questions.
Muchas gracias.
Thank
Querida
you,
doctora
dear
Matilde, por la
Dr.
excelente
Matilde, for your
conferencia.
excellent
Es
conference.
muy importante
It's
la manera en
very
que
important
inició
how you
aclarando
started by
conceptos
clarifying
claves
key
cuando
concepts
hablamos de
when we talk about climate change and health. The concept of risks, showing us the different risks that we have, impacts by exposure, the threats, the vulnerability, the hazard. We need to clarify this concept. And you also mentioned that this climate crisis has caused dangerous and widespread disturbances in nature and climate with extreme climate changes such as extreme heat, glacier actions, and have consequences such as forest fires and flooding, among many others. All of these contribute and affect life health of millions of people and also contributes to increase inequality. For example, the gender inequalities. Climate justice is crucial because those who have less contribute to climate change are the ones that are most affected in a disproportionate fashion. The current challenge for governments, citizens, and all the social actors is fundamental, and each one of us can contribute to the reduction of this problem. To talk about the significant experiences of how to deal with these challenges, we welcome Dr. Raquel Andrade Cardoso. She's graduate in nutrition from the Federal University of Goiás in gastronomy. She's a master's degree in food science and PhD, and she coordinates the culinary science centers at the School of Nutrition and current another very important project at the University of Goiás in Brazil. She coordinates projects in food, biodiversity, and human health. She has experience in the areas of dietetics, culinary sciences, food sciences, product development, biodiversity, use of byproducts for food and nutrition. She currently coordinates the Sustentaria project, a transdisciplinary network of professional students pioneering bridging the gap between scientific knowledge and society regarding sustainable food and its connections with the health of people and the planet. She is also a member of the Latin Food Group and representative of the Planetary Health Alliance in Latin America. Go ahead, dear Dr. Raquel, you have the floor. Thank you, Berta. First of all, I would like to thank and ask understand that I'm talking Portuguese, so I'm going to speak Portuñol. I hope that everybody can understand my presentation. First of all, I would like to thank for the invitation to this webinar and Dr. Gabriel and Dr. Matilde for the brilliant lectures, very clear presentation of all the data that are contained in this IPCC report. And then we see all these situations. I think that it's important to reflect on how we are participated in this process and what is our role in changing the situation or finding solutions. When I talk us, I'm talking us, individuals, as researchers, as society, scientists, all these aspects. Next slide, please. So, as Berta quite introduced me, I'm Raquel Santiago. Next slide, please. Today, we're talking about climate change. In 2022, there was the 30th anniversary of the signature of the Convention of United Nations on Climate Change. And in this agreement of the countries that participated of this agreement, they had to prevent the hazards of climate change the danger of human interference and their effect on human health. It is important to highlight that since that time, very few things have been done in order to have significant measures to have an important or significant impact in relationship, for example, with carbon emissions due to energy. Has this been impacted the entire system? At the same time, the world generation of power, electrical power, has also been dominated by fossil fuels to the extent that the renewable energy contributes very little. So climate change has decreased and has impact on all health areas, including mental health, increasing fragility of systems that depend on all the climate and environmental structure, increasing the vulnerability of the populations and geopolitical crisis, energetic crisis, life this with this situation the populations live. So next slide. We come to this wonderful discussion and presentation of information about the special report of this intergovernmental group of experts on climate change. How this impact of increase of 1 degree or 1.5 degrees when it's compared to the pre-industrial era has had impact in the gas emissions and in the context of how we see the world response to this threat of climate change, to the sustainable development goals, and the efforts of fighting against poverty. So this report may be found, it has been presented in different fora, and I would like to highlight this first summary made for policymakers, given the importance in the impacts Dr. Matilde told us with regards to funds in the global south of how we could involve this group of persons so they have an important impact in the application of resources from each of those governments to change this landscape. Next slide. So climate change, as been mentioned today, has an impact and threat health of all the populations in the world and intensifies storms and meteorological extremes, events and affects production of agriculture, it increases drought and flooding, and it changes the propagation of infectious diseases, such as dengue, for example, in South America. It decreases mental health, impacts mental health, increases poverty, and increases migration. So the response to climate change could bring very important benefits to our planet, right? According to the IPCC report, we have 4 characteristics that describe the current situation and trends. The first is the observed warming and its causes. All the human activities, mainly through the emission of greenhouse gases, have created an significant impact on global warming and how this interferes with lifestyles, consumption patterns, and the production in different regions and countries. The report also has second current situation, the observed changes and impacts. Changes have generated a generalized changes in the oceans, in the atmosphere, biosphere, and the change generated by men is affecting many other meteorological phenomena. I'm not going to talk with important specialists in this room about these characteristics of being clearly presented when we talk about these issues of the observed changes due to the interference of the population, human population in this process. Also considers the current progress in adaptation and gaps and challenges. What are those that we need to consider with different sectors? So what will be the adaptation, the important adaptation measures, type of evidence we have in each one of the regions, what has been reached, or what are the goals for adaptation in regards to this activity, and how progress, shortcomings, and current mitigation challenges have increased since the last report, but are not sufficient to say that we are evolving in an adequate manner. There are differences between the anticipated emissions with the policies that have been applied and other necessary recommendations and human resources and economic resources in order to comply with the goals of the mitigation of the climate objectives in all regions and sectors. Right? The report also includes in their summary a part with regards to the future climate change risk and long-term responses, and the future, the climate change in the future has already been mentioned, so I'm not going to go into more detail. But the greenhouse gases emissions that contribute to global warming. So we have to take some urgent measures, immediate measures to change this. The climate change impact and climate-related risks. So today, when we look at warming or climate change, that there is an important impact already present in the quality of life, in the disruption of all the ecosystems when we're talking about temperature increase. So the risks are anticipated and are present, and if there is an increase in temperature, and that's going to have more and more impact by creating more complex risks in a cascade fashion that can have more impact in all the process of climate change. They have the probability of risk of unavoidable, irreversible, or abrupt changes that are changes that there's no how to modify them, And these can be limited when you tend to have a profound, quick, and sustained reduction on world emissions. For that, we need a mobilization all so we can. It also mentions some adaptation options and their limits in a warmer world. The report also mentions that these adaptation options may be valuable and efficacious, but that and with this increase in temperature and global warming, the damage and losses in other human systems are at the limits and that we need to have an adaptation. And this may lead losses or irreversible processes and loss of adaptation to all these processes. Carbon budgeting and net zero emissions, as it has been mentioned, will be to limit global warming caused by man, and then the mitigation pathways in all the global territories to limit warming are needed so we can do a quicker, more profound modifications in the case of greenhouse gas emissions in all the sectors during the next, for this case, the global emissions, if they reach in different groups, as it has been mentioned, in different countries with their own characteristics. Expecting that up to 2050, we're going to have more positive results. But we need to start with those changes now. Finally, if we don't achieve or we move away, we exceed of eating and return level, we will not be able to return gradually to reach those. So in the long term, we need to try, and we are, although we are presently with a huge issue, and we need to try to reverse this situation. Next slide. So as recommendations and short-term responses, in order, also we need to work in all these short-term responses, but we cannot leave aside that there's some urgency of integrated climate actions in the short term. So the benefits of these short-term actions will be a mitigation and an accelerated adaptation of mitigation measures that will be able to reduce the losses anticipated by the persons in their ecosystems and will bring many benefits, natural benefits, in terms of air quality. Some mitigation and adaptation options will be necessary for quick transitions and to have a long reach all sectors so we can have significant reductions and profound reductions to guarantee a more friendly and sustainable future for all. And synergies and trade-off with sustainable development and equity and a quick adaptation of those effects of climate change. And it's very important for the development for the development of a more sustainable world, we have mitigation and adaptation actions or options in all the SDGs. And if we start to put or pay more attention to these goals, perhaps we will have a short-term response quite significant. Inclusion are also important factors for climate and social justice, and the inclusion of this transition process may allow an adaptation that comes sooner with the using ambitious mitigation measures and a development that is resistant to climate. All these processes may improve social protection with options of reducing consumption, intensive consumption and intensive emissions, and this can obtain from measures and changes in behavior and lifestyles that may bring benefits and well-being to the entire society. We come to a crucial point, which is governance and policies. Political commitment and a multi-level governance are essential. They should be very well established with institutional frameworks and political strategic laws that must have the capacity of caring for all the groups with specific characteristics for each of those groups, with greater access and a better way of communicating, so we can put larger amounts of financing and to develop technologies that can be capable of to an effective change in climate problems in a more with more efficacy. And the financing and technology and international cooperation. A meeting like this, today's webinar, is an important activity, so we can start with communication networks that can share common efforts in different sectors, so we can be reach. We can come to actions and investments that can modify or at the worldwide level investment for mitigation and adaptation to climate problems. Next. So, considering all these recommendations and this IPCC report, short and long-term activities, I'm going to give you a short story of two groups that are aimed to precisely work on these actions to generating scientific evidence to put all this issue of climate change under discussion and to present evidence and possible solutions. So first, I would like to talk about a group that I'm part of. This is the Lancet Countdown South America, promoted launching their first regional report with regards to 2022 regarding health and climate change, where we need to trust the science, and now that we know, we must act. So this is exactly what we have as a discussion point when we talk about climate change. During recent years, we've seen a growing evidence about the intersection between health, relation between health and climate change. And despite this growth at a global level, most of the evidence from the country are from other countries that are not necessarily South American and difficult to use in a generalization to other regions in the world, as Daniela mentioned. So the Lancet Countdown, a report on health and climate change in South America, had the goal to monitor the impact of climate change in well-being of people in the region, as well as to propose and to understand the national and local responses that must be given, turning the climate change threats in health in an opportunity to improve it. So for the first time, as I mentioned before, our group published this regional report that deals with this issue or this topic of how we have to act. In 2022, the seventh global report from Lancet Countdown was issued on health and climate change, and from this, we've done a discussion on how been the impact of climate change coming from scientific evidence, the space of South America. I bring this experience and many of the data that have been discussed and work in this process, take into consideration of the IPCC data. Next slide. So our working group was done with 5 working groups of the Lancet Countdown, with methodologies that were aligned in 5 key domains. The first is the hazards to health, exposure to impacts. Number 2 is adaptation planning and health care. Number 3, actions and benefits for health. And number 4, economy and finance. And 5th, public and political participation. The results and conclusions of this report reach a consensus of several fields of knowledge experts that cover 25 indicators that are summary in 4 key messages. We have, it's very clear that climate change is harming the health, as Dr. Matilde was mentioned. It's affecting the health of South Americans with a delay in the providing the benefits of health. Next slide. We have these 4 messages, key messages, that the climate change is harming the health of South Americans, and it is time to take immediate action. South American countries must increase their preparedness to protect the populations from the health impacts of the climate crisis. And South America must continue and accelerate its efforts towards zero carbon transition. And South American countries need serious financial commitment to respond to the challenges posed by climate change. So here we have efforts, first on the short term and then to the long term, what we anticipate in the IPCC report in an attempt with this case that I have here a proposal to create of there's much things that we can do in terms of research and scientific evidence. We urgently need to start a more discussion among the South American and Latin American countries, in perhaps even with the Caribbean countries. A second group that I'm part of is the Planetary Health Alliance, that throughout the years they are building a global community of planetary health that goes across discipline sectors, generations, and geography. With this proposal, this alliance have committed to have a more members from in research institutions and to facilitate process of centers throughout the world. And this is the function that I have now, the position that I have now on behalf of the Planetary Health Alliance in the Latin American group. And in this build-up of strategies to create solutions for climate changes, the Health Alliance has an education proposal in planetary health that is very strong, that is trying to dictate new courses, conferences, undergraduate and graduate programs that involve people, the professors and initiatives from universities that emerge throughout the world to support and increase the efforts in trying to bring solutions to climate change with new options. So in this group, we always work with a proposal of a large transition, makes the important the understanding of all the situation. So for this, we created this framework to guide planetary health education as a central strategy, as an option to climate change. Next slide. This is almost the final one. To present that I would like to highlight. I'm not going to present all these framework, but I would like to highlight that to have a significant impact in the application and interpretation, in have a role of this framework, it is important to understand its organization and provide attention to nature as a species or individuals is in the center of this framework. Interconnection with nature that promotes values and competences in permanent learning instead of looking for immediate results. So this major transition, it requests or needs and wants to understand how nature is in with all its characteristics with human interference and modifications of systems, and to do a complex thinking of equity and social justice with inclusion in the entire process. From all this process of education, it is clear for us, from these groups that are working in Lancet as well as in planetary health, that the communication is our most important activity, and perhaps the activity that's most important in creating an interference to change processes. And in understanding, we are trying to work in Brazil with the Planetary Health Brazilian Group, people from different sectors in a perspective, trying to find key messages for each one of these groups. So there is a document that was drafted by several institutions in 2021. That is the Sao Paulo Declaration that tries of generating key messages for different sectors of how each one could participate in trying to create new connections and how the humans are interfering and what will be the role and how could you try and propose solutions. It is important that all sectors that are participated in this situation must have a with greater number of persons working in all these climate changes. Otherwise, all this rich material generated by this group
todo o panorama e todos os grupos de trabalho com panoramas, com impactos e com possibilidades e sugerências de soluções e implementação de
with
soluções
trying to implement short-term and long-term solutions would not make sense.
Então, mais uma vez, gostaria de agradecer.
So I would like to thank for this invitation. I'm here for any clarification or doubts. Thank you. Thank you, dear Raquel. Thank you very much for your excellent lecture. It indicates that we have quite relevant scientific evidence on the causes and consequences of climate crisis. And it also highlights that there are several viable and efficacious options to contribute to solving this climate crisis and reduce the greenhouse gases emissions. And among the alternatives you emphasize, among many others, equity, governance, financing, show us significant experiences such as the Lancet report on South America between of health and climate change. Trust the science. Now that we know, we must act, was the title of this report. In the Andean Health Organization, we organized a webinar dedicated to the presentation of this report. Thank you very much for reminding us that was on March 30, for those of you who will be interested in learning about it. You also show the experience of the Planetary Health Alliance with this proposal for integration and education on planetary health, courses and conferences emphasizing this with nature in the center. Thank you very much. We thank all of you who have been connected from the Ministry of Health, academic centers in different institutions, social from Argentina, Belize, Bolivia, Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Cuba, Ecuador, Spain, Guatemala, England, Mexico, Nicaragua, Paraguay, Peru, Uruguay, Venezuela, among many others countries. We have many greetings and congratulations. Thank you very much to everyone. To continue with dialogue, I will ask Gabriel to activate your video. We've had many questions, and I will read the questions that we have systematized. Gabriel, what indicators has the panel adopted to look at the level of substitution of transportation by electric cars? How are you measuring the protection in the increase of arborization? And also, if the panel is analyzing environmental conflicts and collective actions that are derived from this and the repercussions in policies that are favorable to solution. I will make the questions to Matilde and to Raquel. You can start thinking about your answers. For Matilde, they ask her, what evaluation has been done by the panel with regards to the role that the ancestral knowledge of originary people can have, indigenous peoples or Afro-descendants, in relation to the environmental practices? And they also ask you, if we were to carry out a regional project about health and climate change, what would you prioritize? And for Raquel, they ask her, what expectation do you see for Latin America with regards to the United Nations frame convention on climate change that's going to be carried out in December, November 30th and December 12th in Dubai, that is proposing that one day to be dedicated to health analysis. That's also planning to have a meeting for ministers of health, and they have proposed, or we have learned, that this is a convention that is prioritizing health more than other conventions. And if you could please make a comment about in artificial intelligence and the challenges we have with regards to climate change and health. Those are the questions that we have systematized so far. There are many others, but we have time limitations. Thank you. So now, Gabriel, you have the floor. Go ahead.
Hola,
Hello.
¿me escuchas? Sí.
Can you hear me? Yes.
Bueno, bueno, bárbaro.
Well,
Buenísimo. Bueno, gracias por las preguntas.
well, thank you for your
Hay algunas
questions.
preguntas que por
There's
ahí
some
no he
questions
terminado de entender bien
that
porque
I do not
tienen que
quite
ver con el
understand because they
panel
suggest that the
hace
panel,
trabajo
IPCC,
de campo y no,
makes their own
específico.
field work, and that's
Respecto
not the case. With
de qué
regards to
indicador se
what
utiliza para
indicator is
evaluar
being
la,
used to
la
evaluate
transformación del sector transporte, etcétera,
transformation of the
no, no es que se
transportation
usa un
sector,
indicador para
we don't
eso.
use an
Lo que
indicator
sí
for
se
that, because
hace
what
es
the IPCC
evaluar
does
las
is to
consecuencias que
evaluate
puede
the
tener
consequences
la
that
transformación de un
may
sector de
be
transporte con distintas
present with
medidas,
the
electrificación,
changes in
entre
that
ellas, pero no solo
sector
eso.
of transportation.
Después se evalúa
So we
cómo esa
evaluate
transformación del sector
how those
transporte
transformations in the
funciona
transportation sector and,
de
their
ese sector
possible options of
impacta en
transformation
distintos
have an impact in
aspectos del
different
desarrollo
areas of
sustentable, etcétera.
sustainable
Yo
development
mostraba
and others.
una suerte de
I
tabla
have
en la
shown a
que
sort of
se veía
table
un poco ese
where you
crecimiento
show
dinámico
that
y la posibilidad
correlation
de
with
que
each
el
possible
sector del
measure
transporte
that
pueda
be taken in
impactar
transportation sector could have a positive
positivamente
impact or negative
en
impact
distintos
in the
objetivos de
different
desarrollo sostenible,
SDGs,
etcétera.
etc.
Eso es lo que se hace. Después,
That is
respecto
what we do. Now, with regards
de la cuestión forestal, de los
the
bosques que
forest,
comentamos,
and
etcétera, lo mismo, no es que sea
I have a
específico
similar
para
answer.
eso,
Is we haven't done any field
plantea
studies. We
opciones
just
distintas en
proposes
función de las
options
consecuencias
and what would be
de
the
esas
consequences of
opciones, las
those
consecuencias
options,
positivas, pero también las
if,
negativas.
as well as the negative consequences,
Después
of
habla
course.
de conflictos
And then it
ambientales.
talks about
No
environmental
recuerdo
conflicts.
exactamente,
I don't remember
pero no es,
exactly,
de
but it
nuevo,
is,
aquí
once
no
again,
es que sea, sí.
it is,
Hay un capítulo nuevo
there
que
is
es
a new
muy
chapter
interesante en
that
el
I mentioned
grupo de trabajo 3,
in the
que
working
hace
group 3
referencia
that
a
alludes
las
to
cuestiones sociales,
the social
etcétera, y
issues
cómo los hábitos y
and
comportamientos
how habits and
influyen un
behaviors
hábito y
influencing
viceversa.
climate change and vice versa.
Pero no
And
sé si ahí nos llega a
but
hablar
I
de
don't know
conflictos
if
ambientales
they
a ese
talk about
punto
environmental
o que no hay
conflicts.
una profundización
So
de eso. No sé
there's
si había
no,
alguna otra
I don't
pregunta.
know if there was another question.
Estás muteada, no te escucho.
Thank you very much, Gabriel. Those were the two questions that were sent to
Bueno,
you. Thank you very much. Matilde, you have the floor. Yes, thank you. Thank you for the questions. Reinforcing what Gabriel mentioned, we have to understand that IPCC, what they do is to collect and gather all the information that has been published in scientific works that may be relevant and can have been evaluated by peers but it's not they don't do their own research. It collects the information that's state of the knowledge in these matters. And that goes to the question of what evaluations we do with regard to the role that the indigenous knowledge or ancestral knowledge play. Fortunately, in this report, there's much more information than the previous one. There's much information about ancestral knowledge because there are recommendations to likely consider many take those knowledge and those environmental policies that have been generated and have been successful in adaptation to changes in the climate. So in this report, there's much more information because there are more publications. Those publications be accessible to the authors of the IPCC. We're looking for things that have been published. Fortunately, the more value what can be known about ancestral knowledge. And the other interesting thing when we talk about a regional project on climate change health, following what mentioned by the previous speaker, the problem that we have in our region, the most important problem, I believe, is a lack of information that's available, especially in terms of health, in terms of habitat, health. There we have lack of information in time and in form, because information is perhaps present in the paper, but it's filed in some hospital that is not centralized or is not available to the people that want to investigate on the impacts of climate change on health. So when we talk about indicators, the first thing that we need to consider is that the health information and environment in habitat information must be available in time and form. What I mean, if I'm going to study for example, if I do the impact of climate on health, the data is at the country level because each country has different climates, populations, different vulnerabilities. So it is important to take that into concrete action that helps in this regard in preventing the impacts are the meteorological alerts, for example, alerts about heat waves. How can you generate an alert? Because we know that the heat wave has generated mortality. In terms of those previous studies, we can establish an alert. Those alerts are a measure of adaptation to climate change that prevents negative impacts on the population. The first thing we have to do is to work with the information so that the information is available. That's the thing I believe is the most relevant, and with that we can build the indicators that we know that have an impact. Thank you very much. Thank you. Go ahead, dear Raquel.
Bueno, voy a aprovechar y invertir la orden de las preguntas.
I'm going to start with the last question, talking about artificial intelligence. And Dr. Matilde, we have the data, but they have not been presented in a safe way or correct way. So this is a very good tool that we can start to involve people who deal with these topics and make this necessary interdisciplinarity in different areas that can work together and to put this evidence of how climate change has interfered in the health of the populations. When we look at all these graphs in the presentations of outcomes of this report, I think that this has helped to have to use the presentation of these indicators that are shown in this report when we talk about what to include for the next convention. I think that we have a very important group of researchers in South America, in Latin America, that are already starting to work in communicating proposals of how we could reach. And I think that, and this is just my opinion, and we have started in the lunch group in thinking who are going to invite to talk about this topic and to start discussion on what would be more relevant for the region, to have a proposal to present as representative of the entire region of South America. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. We thank for your questions. We were not able to respond all, but we will take them into account to define the topics for the next webinars. We appreciate your participation and interest. To close this space of questions and answers, I will ask you to each one of you, all the three speakers, to leave us a final message in 1 minute, please. Go ahead.
Bueno, de nuevo, gracias.
Well, once again, thank you.
No, muy simple.
It's very simple. In my final message is that climate change requires complex solutions and involve everything. And focus its center in the development model that we've been having this last decades or early century and a half. And those complex solutions required of comprehensive looks and approaches, things more holistic, and taking care of this and considering the situation of each place and region and the resource and the culture. Just that. We need to think before acting. And that thinking before acting requires that comprehensive approach. So we can make the best decisions. Thank you again. Bye. Well, once again, thank you. And I think this is very interesting to consider that the information is instrumental, that we can all work in an interdisciplinary fashion, looking for solutions to prevent the impacts and adapt to climate change. We need to know each other. We need to know and put all that information available so we can work. As Raquel mentioned, there are many scientists and people interested in contributing with their knowledge and understanding that every minute counts, that the more we delay in taking those complex actions with this holistic vision, the more we take, the more difficult it's going to be to solve these negative impacts of climate change that is bringing to us. So propose solutions to adapt and avoid the negative impact as soon as possible. Well, I think with the two previous speakers has said everything. I'll just try to summarize a few words. On communication are the best tools to try to find and consider all the cultural characteristics and to put the evidence available so we can make this possible. That is not simple, but needs each one of us to do things. So communication and connections, I think we require to improve in Latin America to have better actions and solutions. Thank you once again for the invitation. Thank you to you. We reiterate our thanks for the excellent presentations today, to Gabriel Banclo, to Matilde Rusticuzzi, Raquel de Andrade Cardoso. We have received many congratulations in social networks. Thank you very much. To all participants, to the Horas Conu team, and to all the people who participated in this activity, thank you. And this has been possible thanks to the commitment with the Andean and Latin American integration. Now, I give the floor to Dr. Mariel Carmen Calle to close this webinar on behalf of the Andean Health Organization. Hipólito, in unanimous agreement, go ahead. dear Dr. Calle. Thank you, Bertita. My first words are to found thanks to you three. It's been a magnificent webinar. When this has been a magnificent webinar because this is a topic in which the Andean Health Organization is working intensively, and somewhat depressed we see that we are not achieving everything we want. You have talked about many things. I would like to thank this way so clear. You have expressed how we mitigate, how to decrease. This is an intersectoral topic. It is multidisciplinary, complex topic. But you also told us clearly what are the risks that we are exposed to. And in all your presentations, you have very shyly, quite strongly, but we still need more power, the governance and public policies topic. I think this is an issue of political will, political decision. This goes beyond our technical. It goes to the political arena. Why? Well, because what a person can do to mitigate has nothing to do with what a nation can do. Establishing clear policies for certain companies, for certain processes that are the ones that cause the higher amount of the things that we're suffering. So the issue of politics is very difficult. And that is one of the reasons why the Andean Health Organization is fully convinced that health should be in the core of the policies. We've had this period of, I would say, of being in the spotlight. We've been the hot point for 3 years because of the COVID pandemic. But we see sadly that health is coming outside the center of policies. And the topic of climate change is an important topic related to health. Definitely, you three of us have mentioned Gabriel, Matilde, and Raquel, especially in our Latin America, and more special in South. So what are we seeing? I say South America, but Central America is also the portion because our region is in South America. Well, we are facing all the issues and problems, and we are having more diseases. We are suffering the consequences already. But however, the actions are not being taken, the ones that are more concrete and more, how could I say it, more intense. This. That's not being done. We've been part of the COP in Glasgow, I think. We've been present in the COP in Egypt. Perhaps probably we're going to be in Dubai. We deeply thank all the work of civil society, of the programs, of the initiatives. I like very much this shared initiative by Raquel. This framework is fabulous because it's a very comprehensive way. So I think that we have to take seriously when we talk these anthropogenic changes at planetary scale, the socioeconomic and cultural conditions at the local level that you very well know after the COVID, what's going on, and health and the system of change, systemic thought, equity, justice, interconnection, and of course, the local priorities of learning. And here we need to be very respectful, and we are promoting this dialogue of knowledge. This is what we presented in COP. But I think we need to push more. That's the reason of our institutions is to contribute to health and well-being of the population of the 6 countries. That's clear for us. That's our work. We do it daily, and we do it with consequence. We have adopted the trees in Madre Dios. So we not only organize webinars, but we land in more concrete things, because I think that you should be consequent with what you promote. I think we're making progress, but we still need much more to do. So this issue of climate change is a topic that we place in every state, not only here. I'm part of the Peruvian Society of Pediatrics, of International Society of Pediatrics, and with Bertita, we have introduced climate change in all those areas. Create awareness. This topic, ladies and gentlemen, is of terms of survival. I don't think they realize that, because this is going to happen in the next generations. Going to suffer all the consequences. Still not aware of what's coming. I would not like to extend myself. Thank you very much for your presence. You know that after these webinars, there's always technical meetings, so we will be you for a new meeting, but at a level of 6 countries. We consider that the 3 presentations have been wonderful, very clear, and the most important, quite motivating to make better decisions at the level of our governments. I would not like to forget to invite you for the next webinar. The next webinar is next Thursday at 11 a.m. and the topic is dengue. Dengue. Moment. Love that those maps of the movement of the mosquito. Yeah, that's right. I really liked it, Matilde, because it's very graphic how this gradually increases. And we're going to talk about clinic diagnosis and treatment. We know that our countries at this moment are suffering with many cases of dengue. And following what we see, the trend is that we're going to have much more cases in the coming years. Thank you very much for your presence. Thank you, Bertita. Thank you once again, Gabriel, Matilde, Raquel. See you next Thursday at 11 a.m. Thank you very much.